I want to analyze and try to understand Mr. Trump's logic behind his decision. So I think based on his speech, as well as Peter Navarro's and the Lighthouse's their public speech, I think basically they're coming out of this logic that, number one, they believe that the trade deficit is a bad thing. Yes. Too loud? Okay. And second logic behind this is that if trade deficit is a bad thing, and the trade deficit can be reduced by imposing tariff. The third logic here is that since China, the bilateral trade deficit between U.S. and China is about 2/3 of the total U.S. trade deficit. U.S. trade deficit is, in terms of goods and services, in terms of goods, is about $700 billion. And if take out of the trade surplus in the service part, about $250 billion. So the U.S., the current account balance deficit is about $500 billion. And the bilateral trade deficit between China and the U.S. is about $350 billion. So it's about 2/3 of the total deficit. So one natural conclusion from Mr. Trump here is that if we can control the trade deficit against China, and 2/3 of trade deficit with of the U.S. will be resolved. And since tariff is very effective, and let's impose a tariff against China. Right? So this seems to be the logic. I think this is very much old mercantilist thinking, and mercantilist thinking has been discredited a long time ago by the economists, but has been very much alive, particularly among many politicians. And the trade deficit is economists mostly would agree that trade deficit is not necessarily a bad thing. And U.S. has been running the trade deficit since 1980s. And currently, the trade deficit actually, as a percentage of GDP, is not the highest. And right now, it is about 3%, or less than 3% in this whole year. And the highest the trade deficit as a percentage of GDP was reached about a little over 10 years ago, 2006, about 6%. So right now, we are not even the highest. And look at the U.S. economy has been doing pretty well in the 1990s, and during this cycle, and look like U.S. economy is likely to break the record. But if we continue the growth, if there's no recession hits, to next year in the summer, we will break the record. Will be the longest the bull market in the history. So the trade deficit is not necessarily a bad thing. And if you look at the trade surplus, Russia had trade surplus for quite many years, and Russia's economy not doing well. We all knew that. So the second thing is that the tariff is not likely to change the U.S. trade deficit position. As John just talked about, that the trade deficit is in fact a reflection of the macroeconomic situation. And we all know that the trade deficit reflects the savings and the investment. Given that the U.S. investment, domestic investment, is larger than its national savings, and naturally, U.S. runs a trade deficit, or the current account deficit in this case. And given that the Trump's decision of a physical tax cut and try to encourage the investment in the U.S., so it's unlikely the gap between saving and the investment is likely to narrow, so unlikely that it's going to change the trade balance for the United States by using tariffs. Just think about this, imposing tariff against China, even if we're not buying goods from China, certain goods that we are not going to produce by ourselves. And anyway, in the end, if the shoes are not going to be produced in China, they're going to produce in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in somewhere else. So they are not moving back to the U.S. to be produced. So this is the things that I think a lot of misunderstanding here about the politicians and on this. There's often, you hear people asking the question, and when I was talking to people, the business people, the question people ask is, who will win? Of the trade war, and when we talk about people talk about trade war, the natural question here is that who will win? Who has the upper hand? Right? And it is quite a legitimate question here. My answer here is that who will win depend on win or lose depend on the objective you define. Like you go to the war, right? You go to the war, you define the objective. If we can achieve the objective, and you win the war. And the second question related to that is at what cost? You can certainly win the war, but cost is huge. Cost is very high. And if the objective is to reduce the trade deficit, I don't think that the U.S. will win the war by imposing the tariff, because as we say that the trade deficit is defined by it's a macro situation. Using the tariff if the goal is to make the Chinese government to change its behavior, either reduce the subsidy to the state-owned enterprises or maybe making Chinese economy more open, that is a possibility. But this is also what China has been doing in the last 30 years. If you look at the behavior of the Chinese government, they have been constantly reforming the economy and open up the economy. And this is consistent with the Chinese, at least in the public, that they declare that they want to they want to do more reform and more open society. But under the pressure, I don't think Chinese government will yield under the pressure. I think the best way to resolve it, and in fact, if you look at the history of during this war, during this trade war, China was actually eager to resolve with the American government, and they have been eager to send in the delegation to negotiate. But I think the best way to solve this is someone will have to manage Mr. Trump's Twitter account. And take away the cell phone, probably these things will be much easier to resolve. The second question here is that what does China see this? If you go to China, if you're following the newspaper or following the discussion in China, there's a lot of discussion about the trade war. Here in the US, probably not much discussion on trade war. In China, it's overwhelming. In the newspaper, in the internet, everywhere, people talk about this trade war. They discuss this from different angles. There is a tendency, seems to me, that there's a lot of intellectuals as well as business people, they perceive these things, this trade war, as a mechanism for the United States to contain China. Whether it's true or not, doesn't really is out of it probably is not relevant. Sometimes perception is more important than the reality. Now, if China perceived this as a mechanism by the U.S. to contain China, try to put down China, a rising China, and that would make it is even more confrontational, and China will likely take a much harder stance against the U.S., even though it is not originally intention by the U.S. government. So a third question is, can they settle? When you talk to business people very much concerned about, we don't like a trade war and hope that they can settle these things. They will negotiate. Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi is going to meet in November. And usually in November, before November, probably the both sides are likely to, they would like these things to be resolved. My guess that the chance is still there, and there's still high probability they will resolve these things before November, before these two guys and get together and meeting each other. But the important thing is that try not to be put pressure in the public. China, no Chinese, because Chinese, for those people understand the Chinese history, you probably understand and you know that what happened in about 150 years ago, the Opium War, and the least things the Chinese government wants to perceive is that they yield under the pressure, and under the foreign pressure particularly. So I think given the two sides some quiet period, and possibly miraculously, the trade dispute might be resolved. Thank you.